Good afternoon. I am so happy to be here with two of my friends today for a serious conversation about Holocaust education and related topics. So, joining me are Ivy Schamis, formerly the Holocaust teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, and Rabbi Hazzan Jeffrey Myers of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. Thank you both for sitting down to have this conversation today.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Always good to be with you.
So let me start. Since you're both really incredible, gifted Holocaust educators, what are some of the modern day lessons that we garner from the Holocaust that demonstrate how timeless it is?
Um, well, I think that the lessons from the Holocaust are timeless, actually, because it covers so many different types of topics that could be related to anything that's happening, especially in current events. I always started my class by talking about what was happening or asking the students what they knew actually about what was happening in current events and what was happening in modern day times. But the whole idea behind that Holocaust education and the themes in Holocaust education was covering things like a social and emotional learning, critical thinking. We talked about basically civic education, and the point behind all of that is to make good global citizens out of the students that were learning Holocaust. And it also gave a good chance for moral reflection. So many of the current event um, many of the current events that are in the news today really reflects on what's happened over the years, and taking the Holocaust education and all of those themes into effect would really, it was basically timeless. It was basically timeless.
Yes, and so I'm thinking less about what happens in a high school classroom and more about what we learn from our knowledge of the Holocaust that explains things that are happening now or happened in the years between the Holocaust and now. So I think about things like the potential for man's inhumanity toward man. I think about things like complicity and bystander behavior. And on the flip side of that, there are also the positive stories of the rescuers, the incredible stories of the survivors that inspire us. So, I mean, it's such a human story, and it has, the most horrifying things you can imagine and probably the most hopeful things you can imagine. So it's a balancing act of pulling out, where do we learn from this and where are we inspired by it?
Hmm. I would expect that both of you would say that Holocaust education is more important and more relevant than ever. So, expecting you're going to say yes, explain a little bit about where does that yes come from? Why would you feel that way?
I remember having a conversation with my students about the immigrants that are coming over here from all over, but especially what's happening now in the news, and how we treat people and how we would like to be treated, the relevance of conspiracy theories and propagandists, and um, all of those types of conversations about how these things started and what they lead to. And I think that the relevance of what's happening in the world, and what, we would start the day with a 5 minute like a news clip and what's happening, and we would see all kinds. It's not very hard to find anti-Semitic articles and anti-Semitic news from all over the world. And so we would find that, and not to be a Debbie Downer, because what Lauren said about finding hope, I never um, would have teach a class without giving hope to what happened with people that were maybe not so famous rescuers, like someone named Leopold Sosha, who helped people in the sewers of Lvov, or Mendez, who helped write visas for people in Portugal. So I think that the hope also is there, and I believe that's also what gives students the hope in what's happening in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in on that too. I think about this as I see, and Ivy is referring to this too in her response, things like the rise in conspiracy theories like those espoused by QAnon, which derive from the protocols of the elders of Zion, which is like, first of all, over 100 years old. always a known forgery, nevertheless promoted around the world, published in the United States by Henry Ford, um, believed in, taught, still taught all over the world. So when you see QAnon and others claiming that there's a global Jewish conspiracy, my first thought is nothing new under the sun. And my second thought is, how do we stop this from still being powerful in the eyes of some people? So, I mean, when we understand how people are taken in by conspiracy theories, when we understand the kind of anger that caused everyday Germans to buy into the Nazi program of propaganda and violence, like, we recognize all of these things when they're happening in front of us because we know about the Holocaust. So when people think that it's not relevant anymore, I want to say, look around you. We still need to know about this.
Hmm. So what kind of steps should we take to expand Holocaust education? Who are the supporters out there that we can align with to bring this about?
Sure, there are so many steps we can take. I just feel like, and when you're out there and you're in the world of education and you see how little, and it's not just students, it's adults, and how little people really know, but how much they want to know. And I think that's the key. The students that come in the class, when we talk in the beginning, why did you take this class? That's the first thing that interests me. Why did you sign up? As if it's not always offered as an elective, but it could just be part of the curriculum in any kind of language arts, in a social studies class. What interests you? And there's so many different varied answers, and they all want to learn more. So I think the interest is out there. I think it's almost like an unbelievable phenomenon too, like they cannot believe what they're learning. And I think that there are so many ways to get the word out. I just not sure if it's organized in any such way. And we've talked about this before, the Never Again Education Act that passed, and in Congress, and everybody sees the need for it, but it's just, I think the logistics of how to get it out there. There are just so many resources. They just have to be put out there for educators to be able to take some kind of professional development and learn about what it is, because I think there's a lot of willing and able students, as same as educators, but the educators need to be educated on how to teach this very sensitive subject. I think it's a very sensitive subject. It's all about reinforcing the whole humanistic values, abuse of power and fear, and as you know, it starts with words, and that's also how this is all brings in what's happening in our world today. So and we're very worried in the Holocaust education world about losing our survivors. They're well into the ones that are still alive are well into their 90s, and having that firsthand experience, the primary source, is extremely powerful. So not everybody lives where there are Holocaust survivors can come in, and they can no longer travel. So now we're lucky enough to have the power of dimensional testimony, as well as Zoom and things that are now recorded. So I know it's not the same as seeing them, but Holocaust survivors are very, very powerful, and they're the treasures that we really need to hold on to.
No denying that. And so many of our small regional Holocaust centers, like Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, although we're growing all the time and we've gone well beyond the region at this point, especially with virtual programs. And, of course, Ivy, I visited your school. So before virtual, we were making connections in other cities too. But when I think about how can we expand Holocaust education, I think about it in a couple of directions. One of them is that a number of states have passed mandates. Ivy taught in Florida, which has a mandate to teach the Holocaust. Here in Pennsylvania, we have a strong recommendation to teach about the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. We do not have a mandate. We aren't on a path to have a mandate. But that is one way that states have taken action to, quote, expand Holocaust education. When that's evenly applied and teachers are equally supported, I think it can be very effective. But it's not always supported or funded, or teachers are not always given the resources that they need. But I think about the question about expanding Holocaust education in another way, which is opening up the conversation to include other genocides, to include social justice, to include what's happening in the world around us right now, because these things we were talking about that we understand from our knowledge of the Holocaust are relevant and are all around us now. So when I think about keeping Holocaust education funded, supported, and important, I think about how do we get people to connect to it so that a student who, I mean, we're talking about Holocaust survivors, they may be the age of the great grandparents of our students now. Nevertheless, these students can feel like this event that happened, you know, it ended 76 years ago. They can feel like they're connected to it nevertheless. So I think expanding Holocaust education means a couple of things, and they're all really important.
It's just hard to imagine not buying in. How can legislators say, well, now that's not important? It's very, very important. And even though Florida had a mandate, I believe, since 1994, there wasn't really much support attached to that mandate. There wasn't really money. There wasn't funding. You have to get somebody, or school superintendent, the school principal, somebody to buy into this and then see, look, this is very successful. What happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in 2000 and I think it was 2012, we said, we would like to, it was a very large school. We tried different things. The principal was open. We would like to try having a Holocaust education program. And lucky for us, he said, okay, thinking, maybe it will happen and maybe it won't. Kids were signing up. They found it interesting. They told their friends. We had 8 full-time classes for a whole year. And they were learning a lot. And it was very interesting. And we brought in definitely other genocides. We had a survivor from the Rwandan genocide, and we talked about Armenia. And we did programs where there was testimony. And so we were able to look at many different aspects of it. And the students sort of related to how this was happening, how this was to them. We had a diverse population. Some kids came from Southeast Asia, or some kids came from Africa, some kids came from South America. This does relate to me. And even if it doesn't, at least I can have empathy for others. And the key in all of the lessons we taught was how to distinguish yourself as an upstander, because as you know, saying nothing and indifference is really the opposite of love and not hate. It's really being indifferent, and how you can be an upstander. So there's a lot of different programs out there to help the educators. I think it's just bringing the lessons to them and showing them how you can expand this type of education.
And it's a great time for me to bring up this initiative we have that started with our Holocaust Educator of the Year from a few years ago, Nick Haberman. He's at a high school just north of the city in Shaler, just north of Pittsburgh. And he started the Light Education Initiative, which is leadership through innovation in genocide and human rights teaching. It is a room in a school. At Nick's school, it's adjacent to the library. It is where he teaches his Holocaust elective. He also has an elective that's a global studies course where he teaches about genocide. These classes draw so many students. His principal, their superintendent, has supported this program. So what it has become is a real student-driven, student-led program where there's Holocaust education happening there, and the students are deciding what's important to them, what matters to them. Just the other day in Harrisburg, virtually, of course, because it's COVID, they acknowledged that April is Genocide Awareness Month. So the state of Pennsylvania has acknowledged that that was all efforts from Nick's students.
That's a big step.
Proclamation.
That's a big step.
Nick's students did all of that work. Last year, they would have been in Harrisburg. It didn't happen because of COVID. They still can't be there, but it was supported by legislators from both sides of the aisle. So, proving your point, Ivy, that it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Holocaust education, human rights education, educating citizens for the future shouldn't be, it doesn't belong to one party.
Right. And if the students show what they know, it's very, very impressive. And it's not just throwing out facts. Yes, it's history, but it's more than history. It's a feeling. And these kids really start to learn empathy, which is really, it's very exciting. You see the lights go off. You see it. You see them going, this is great. I can do that. And I can help others. And this is a course they walk away with, and it's a life lesson. It's really a life lesson. So let me ask you, Rabbi, and Dr. Bairnsfather, how do you answer people who suggest that it's time for Jews to stop utilizing the Holocaust because we hear that, oh, it's time to move on. They talk enough about the Holocaust. How do you answer people that suggest that that's really, it's time to move on?
Well, I think first of it's really easy to just use philosopher George Santayana's comment that those who do not uh, remember the past are doomed to repeat it, which just seems sort of superfluous. We spoke before about the lessons learned. The Holocaust stands out as the shameful mark on humanity since humanity has been in existence on this planet, that such a dreadful thing could be enacted upon a group of people. And we've seen before the Holocaust and then after the Holocaust this continuity of the inability for humans to be able to live together, work together in peace and harmony with not merely tolerance for each other, but for respect and appreciation for each other. So the lessons that come out of the Holocaust are such that they can help inform our daily lives, and we can continue to see them enacted out in so many different places around the world right now. And it seems to me that the lessons still haven't been learned because people are still behaving in comparable ways, still showing the same sorts of behaviors that we saw going back, over 70 years ago. And it makes you sort of scratch your head and wonder, could anything have been different if somehow possibly the leaders involved in this might have learned something in Holocaust education? Could there have been a different outcome? And while we can't answer that, I'd like to be the optimist and say, if one person who's engaged in that sort of behavior now might have had some lessons on the Holocaust, it's very possible that any one of a number of genocides occurring on the planet right now might not be occurring.
I actually thought about this a lot when I thought about the shooter in our high school. I really did. He had come to find out later, he had swastikas on the magazines, the bullets, and I was told that it wasn't a targeted hit on my classroom just because it was a Holocaust studies class. I didn't teach Holocaust studies earlier that day, and just happened to be that class that when the shooter came into that class. But I do think about, what if that student had that class? I don't know. Obviously, we'll never know, like you said, Rabbi, but I would have liked to even have a chance to try to have broadened the horizons of someone who seemed so small-minded. So I think you're absolutely right.
And if I could just extend that to the shooting in the Tree of Life, that and when the shooter attacked it, it's been recorded and represented that the shooter remarked about the Jewish community be involved in helping to settle immigrants in the United States. And you have to pause and wonder for a second. Had that person stopped to perhaps consider, is it possible that when his family came to the United States, perhaps there might have been a Jewish group who helped affect getting his family in and settled in some way, shape, or form? Is that possible? And do you just not know your history? So, yeah, the connection is there.
I want to jump in and come back to the question about, is it time for Jews to stop utilizing the Holocaust and move on? I know that people say this. It's a deeply anti-Semitic thing to say, and very disturbing. So when I hear something like that, and of course I do hear something like that, it makes me think about how in Holocaust education, sometimes we don't have enough time to really get into what the numbers mean even. So if we say approximately 6 million Jewish victims, are we also saying how many Jews there were in Europe in 1933? Like, are we explaining the magnitude of that loss? Are we adequately explaining, 2/3 of the Jews of Europe were killed? 2/3. And, we don't like to make comparisons, but I've said in a group, like, I have two sisters. There are three of us. Two of us would be gone. Like, do you understand what this means for an entire population of people? That the Jewish population of the world has not caught back up to where we were all those many years ago. I mean, it was an annihilation. So for someone to say, get over it, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And so it's so offensive to me, but people have said things like that. People have said things that also reek of Holocaust denial when they don't mean to be denying the Holocaust. Like they talk about the Holocaust against the Jews in Germany. I'm like, okay, I teach Holocaust history. I know there are less than 600,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. So you don't get to 6 million if you don't understand that the Nazis took over the whole continent.
Mm-hmm.
So this gets back to the point of making sure that when people learn about the Holocaust, they really learn the context, right? They learn about what Jewish life was like in Europe. They learn about the policies in the United States that made it impossible for Jews to come and settle here before and after the Holocaust. So there's so much to that question, and I could dig into it probably for hours. Mm-hmm. But my rule of thumb is whenever I hear anti-Semitism, wherever it's coming from in whatever form, I'm going to speak out against it. And if someone says it's time for Jews to get over the Holocaust, they're going to hear an earful.
Sure. And sometimes we feel like we're preaching to the choir, but how do we reach people whose ears are closed, which really goes back to that, I think, because they just don't know. They're not members of this choir. I will just say from my perspective, I was taught in a very diverse high school. I didn't have all the Jewish kids taking Holocaust class because they thought they knew everything. They went to Hebrew school. I had students, such a wide variety. And I think that was the best part. I had kids from all over the world with many different nationalities and backgrounds who were open to listening. And I think that's also the key. How do we get the non-choir to be part of this? Mm.
It begins at the kitchen table. So the real challenge is, how do you get a seat at the kitchen table, which is where, in a literal sense, parents are the primary educators of their children. Their children are going to learn the mores, the customs, the family beliefs as they sit and have a meal together. Mm-hmm. So in the absence of the opportunities to sit and dine with the families who need to do that, goes back to education. More and more in America, we live in silos that were clustered by those that were so similar and alike to us without daring to build bridges to connect to the other silos. The dangers in that we see every single day, because when you don't know your neighbors, it leads to mistrust, misunderstanding, fear, loathing, eventually, as I call it, the H word in speech, and eventually to violence. So it has to start early on that we need to know all about our neighbors. No matter what faith you are, the maximum you're going to be is 50% of the population of the world. So there's still a half a planet that you don't know anything about. I think when we learn more about our neighbors, we can respect who they are, where they come from, their customs, the foods they eat, their family stories. When we have that kind of respect for other people, they're no longer others. They're part of the family of humanity, and they're not them anymore. It's all now part of us. So in the absence of the kitchen table, it has to come from education.
Yeah, and this is something that you demonstrate and model so well, Rabbi, is being curious about other people's experiences. So, I mean, when we have these opportunities to listen to people who've had experiences different from ours, we should be curious in the most positive way, and we should be ready to listen. So talk less and listen more. What, Rabbi, you said something about this. Do you remember what your quote is? We have...
It is a quote in the Talmud. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we should spend more time listening than talking.
Yeah.
Yes.
I hear you.
I love it.
And we're all three in a good profession to be able to really listen. I think really listening, but we're also in a field that needs to be funded. And so if a generous donor anonymously offered an enormous sum of money, how would you use this or utilize it to promulgate Holocaust education? What would you do with these enormous funds that you are given?
Mhm.
Well, independent of the political willpower in states to be able to create a mandate in each state, which just takes time and money to do that. There's something to be said about politicking to get that done. At least for here in the United States, if there could be some way to fund internships for teachers, say over the summer, to be paid to go to, say, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. for a month for an in-depth plunge, and that they're paid to do that. I would certainly want to send them to the National Center for that, and to be able to spend a month there in depth to begin that, and to be able to come back with tools that they could begin their journey and bring the students along on that journey.
So I would want to support local organizations, no surprise here, but like the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, because there are about 80 organizations like ours around the country, and all of us are actively working in our regions. Some of us, like Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, are now beyond our regions. As I mentioned, I would want to fund this light education initiative because it supports the teacher, but beyond that, it's supporting the role in the school so that if the teacher moves on, as many teachers will, somebody else steps into that role and the commitment to Holocaust education remains at that school. And the student empowerment initiative continues. And so those students, I mean, what's happened in Shaler is that the whole climate of the school has changed to one with fewer incidents of hate speech, just it's changed and it spills over into the community. So you're talking about around the kitchen table, the students are bringing that home to their parents. So I would want to fund that and set it up solidly in our region and see how far it could go across the country. And we have a lot of other programs that are going on that are community based. And Rabbi, you and I have done some of that together, like our Athletes Against Anti-Semitism program. There are a lot of initiatives that maybe derived from our knowledge of the Holocaust, but are very much referring to things that are happening around us right now. I would fund these really good, innovative initiatives that are bringing this point home, that not saying, remember the Holocaust, full stop, but remember the Holocaust and here's your action. You know, here's what you do in your time.
I think those funds, it's competitive. You know, the people out there that are, the people that
Extremely.
are enormous donors, it's very competitive to where that money is going to. I will say though, as a Holocaust educator, I've participated in some incredible programs that people really took a lot of effort and time in fundraising for them. But there are some really amazing programs, and I've met some teachers from all over the country in places you wouldn't even think would be likely to have Holocaust education, like small towns in Montana and in North Carolina and Tennessee that run some incredible programs. I just wish more people knew about them and could model them. But yes, I think that the problem is those funds are highly sought after, and there's so many programs that would like to have an enormous donor, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And to connect to what you were saying, Lauren, obviously, Lauren and I both look forward to the day when the Tree of Life reopens, because part of our grand vision is that there'll be a Holocaust museum, the only one of its nature in Western Pennsylvania. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to have funds that we could bus kids in from all over the region, and we're talking a vast catch basin, that could come here and get some exposure, to meet some survivors, to really have an in-depth experience for the day that could just really change, you know, even if it changes one child, that's one child that we've reached.
Mm. So both of you were referring to what happened at your school, Ivy, and of course at the Tree of Life, which just the effects of which are still rippling through our community more than 2 years later. So, I mean, other things have happened in our country, and I often reflect on the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which happened the day after I returned from my first trip to Germany. So I'd been in Germany for the first time, 10 days, all over the place, seeing Holocaust memorials and other sorts of cultural sites, so well thought out, funded by the government. I wake up the day after I get back and I see men marching, chanting, Jews will not replace us, carrying Confederate flags, carrying a flag with the swastika. And I'm thinking, this is the worst thing I'll ever see in my country. And we've seen things that are so much worse, including the events that both of you witnessed. And most recently, nationally, the January 6th attack on the Capitol. People seem emboldened in their anti Semitism. So, how do you respond to that as a Jewish community leader, as a Holocaust educator? How do you respond?
Well, like I always talk to my students, you're not born hating, and this is learned behavior. And so where does this come from? It's, again, it's almost unfathomable. I want to cry when I think about what you just said, because it really is so sensitive, and it's such a horrible way that someone has to live with themselves, being so hateful. And I've told the story before that when I was crouching with my students in the classroom, we were all huddled on the floor and trying to hide in the perimeters of the room. And I kept thinking, what I'm going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do when the shooter comes in? Because I know that if once he shot out the glass, it led to the door handle, and he could just come right in. And I figured that's the end of us. We were all just sitting ducks on the edges of the classroom. And I thought, okay, I'm the adult here, and I'm going to do something. And what came in my mind is, I'm just going to stand up. I figured it'd be the last thing I ever said. And I was going to say, we love you. Because I was thinking, this person was so hateful. How can someone hate because you're coming? I don't know who it was. I didn't know if it was a him, a her, a they. I had no idea at the time. But I just thought, here I'm in a Holocaust class. We were just learning. That day, the students were presenting hate groups that might be on their college campuses, because many of them were seniors. And how are we going to combat hate? What are we going to do when we get on a college campus and we see these groups that want to recruit you to be part of these conspiracy groups or these cults or these and there's so many groups that try to recruit young adults. So this is it's very tough, because you see things like adults wearing Camp Auschwitz shirts and coming out with all of these hateful statements. How do you combat that? So I really think the only way to try to get people to see what's out there is through education. I mean, you can show films and we have these webinars, but what bothers me is who's watching these webinars, and not the people that should be.
Mm.
We have a vast silent majority in the United States of people who feel powerless, that don't think that they have a way to share their voices. And I'm talking about the good, decent people. It's the squeaky wheel syndrome. That's what you're going to hear. I still believe, like Anne Frank did, in the goodness of people, that the vast majority of people are good, decent people. But they're not the ones that we hear from. We continually hear from those bad actors out there. And it kind of makes you wonder, what will it take for the vast silent majority to become a vocal majority? To be able to speak up in firm voice, to say, enough already. Mm-hmm. This is not the direction of our country. This is not what it means to be an American or to live in America. our founding documents, our holy documents, we the people, liberty and justice for all. That doesn't mean liberty and justice for some, and that you get to decide who the some are. It's for all. We have too many people who just feel powerless in this regard. And we look for strong moral leadership out there to be able to make it clear that this is unacceptable, and it needs to be a constant to be able to hear till there's enough of an overpowering voice of morality and ethics in this country to be able to say, this is not what it means to be an American, till it becomes unacceptable. We don't have enough voices to be able to say that, who can speak loudly, that are respected, that are listened to, that can quiet down this continued outburst. And it's not just anti-Semitism, it's so many forms of racism. But I dare say, if you take a look at the groups that have been attacked because of the color of the skin, their religious faith, their sexual orientation, their country of origin, whatever that is, if you group these minorities together, I think the sum total of them is far greater than the people who are saying and doing this evil. So we all need to work together because our commonalities unite us, and we have far more in common than we have that disunites us. To work together, to rise up as a vast moral majority. Gee, where did I hear those words previously? But to be able to say, no, this is not what it means to be an American.
And so we had that in a microcosm in Pittsburgh in the response after October 27th, with so many people saying, we're better than this. We're stronger than the H word, as you would say, Rabbi, or that we're stronger together. And from my perspective, we need to work toward that. That was a promise of our community's response to what happened at Tree of Life. And then we return that by keeping that alive, by continuing to show up for other people. When you talk about the minorities together becoming the majority, that's the fear, right? That's what we're up against. That's why the anger. Jews will not replace us. I mean, that's where that is coming from. So, while we're talking about this lack of Holocaust knowledge, and yet Holocaust references that people aren't seeing for the threat that they are, Camp Auschwitz, nevertheless, you hear people in government, local through national, regularly referencing the Holocaust, making comparisons between the Holocaust and events that are happening now. How should we respond?
I also think, just quickly to piggyback on something that you said about feeling empowered to be able to speak up. And I just want to give a little plug, because I really feel like the activists from Parkland made it, were very inspirational to a lot of people feeling that they had a voice. Maybe many people prior to that felt they didn't have a voice. And from all the feedback that I've read and I've heard, and all of the reaction from the kids from Parkland, I felt very proud to say that those, not only were those students graduates of the Holocaust program at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, but they made people feel that their voice mattered. But comparing everything, and it wasn't by accident, their campaign of never again, really wasn't, because many of them came from the Holocaust class and felt like, what is the message that we want to give? And it just so, to the point. I mean, I know never again might be overused, but it feels so strong. I think it feels so strong. From what I've read and from what I understand is that many Holocaust survivors don't really like comparisons to the Holocaust. I think they find it offensive. They say there's nothing like the Holocaust. Is it trivializing the Holocaust? Maybe it's the political weapon of choice. It's just so, when people say Hitler, it makes everyone feel like, then this is really very important, because look what they're talking about. Rabbi, you mentioned Anne Frank, and there's a meme that I saw which actually resonates with me. It says the law is not a moral compass. The people who hit Anne Frank were breaking the law, and the people who killed her we're actually following the law. So I think that sometimes when we think about that, like, what are we asking the government to do? What laws are we trying to get passed? How are we comparing the Holocaust to things that are happening today? Is it a call to action? So there's a lot of issues that go along with that question.
I think it also reflects a lack of Holocaust education in adults who can just rapidly make a comparison without understanding the gravity of what they're suggesting. Frequently, I've heard remarks made that to me are just an abomination. That, how dare you? You don't have the right to be able to make that comparison, because I do believe that the Holocaust is the seminal example on this planet of man's inhumanity to man, and that there is nothing comparable, which to me is why a Holocaust is with a capital T, the, and a capital H for Holocaust, and it stands out. To compare anything to it, I think, is an attempt frequently for sensationalism and to garner attention. Whereas if the speaker would not be using comparisons to the Holocaust, would most likely not get their attention in media for what their goals are. So it's an intentional utilization, a misuse of history for their own personal goals, without taking a moment to reflect, is this really the right thing to say and the right thing to do? It's all about the me, and it's not about the us.
And right, correct. And I think the lessons, I think that people are just nervous that do study Holocaust, that when they see in comparison of things that are happening today, although nothing can compare with the Holocaust, the question always is, do you think this can happen again? Oftentimes when we had survivors, the students would ask the question. And I also think of something that Primo Levi said, is that if it happened, therefore it can happen again. And that's a very scary thought. But when you study and the Holocaust, and when you learn about the Holocaust, you are now a witness. And then it is your job to tell the story. I sometimes had parents that would say, oh, this is so interesting, or kids would tell me, my mom's reading what we're reading, or she's so interested in what we're doing. A letter was forwarded to me from the Holocaust, the now Holocaust teacher at Stoneman Douglas, who's doing it on Zoom because they had no choice and they were doing it on Zoom. And a kid said, my dad was listening to this whole thing on Zoom and now he wants to listen to all of the lessons. So I think that we've just got to spark that interest. We've got to somehow reach everybody. And I mean everybody, not just people who choose to learn it. We've got to get it out there, but it's a big task we have ahead of us.
No doubt. No doubt.
And it's a collective responsibility too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there's a second category of Holocaust. We can call it analogy or comparison. There's definitely the category you're both speaking about, when someone just wants to get attention. And so they say, it's just like the Holocaust. This is what happened in Nazi Germany, et cetera. Or this person is a Hitler.
Right.
There's another kind that is a more responsible inquiry, where we think about how we can take examples from the Holocaust to understand similar things. That's complicated because if you're going to do that, you have to know the things that you're talking about. So it's not enough to say, oh, the Holocaust, the Nuremberg laws are the Jim Crow South. Not really. But if you know about both things, you can draw those lines of connection, which are real. So for scholars, this is a very fruitful area of inquiry. Never to say that the Holocaust was less than it was, but to say that what we learn from it, because we continue to learn from it. I mean, the book has not been written at this point. A lot of people think we know everything there is to know. Far from it. The more we're curious to find out how it might connect to other things, the greater we'll understand, I would say, our present circumstances. So in that way, I'm in favor of it, but I'm never in favor of it when someone just says, oh, it's like the Holocaust. Like, no, that doesn't work for me.
Correct. Drawing inferences from what about the children in those migrant camps now to the kinder transport.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's tough.
That could be a whole other conversation. I think people are really interested in what brings people together. And while on the face of it, we are members and I'm at one remove, but we're all members of the club that nobody wants to be a member of. Nobody wants to be part of a community that experienced a mass shooting. But yet we are. But in many ways, we knew each other before. Ivy, I met you after Tree of Life. You reached out to me and I've gotten to know you better. Our paths have crossed serendipitously. We were in New York, living in the same place for the same week of advanced Holocaust education, which was a miracle. But Rabbi, I met you when you first came to town, which was before October 27th. So I wanted us to reflect on how we've come to know each other and what these relationships mean to us. And I'll start by saying they have meant everything. I mean, they have really propped me up in difficult times and continue to do so and sustain me as I continue in this work. So I want to thank you both, and I'd love to hear from you.
We love the Pittsburgh community so much. We talk about you all the time. The Parkland community, I was a part of the Parkland community. I lived and raised my children in Parkland for 25 years. I taught in the school for 2 decades. I was very entrenched and engrossed in the Parkland life, and I know that the connection we have with Pittsburgh means so much to many of us. I'm not just speaking for myself. But when I came to the Tree of Life and saw our students' artwork around the fence, again, this is all making me want to cry. It was so moving and so unbelievably incredible. Even the students that did not, and we've traveled to Pittsburgh a couple of times, but even the students that did not travel with me just felt very connected to you. And the minute we saw the news of what happened at the Tree of Life, I reached out to you, Lauren, because I said there has to be a Holocaust connection there. When I saw there was a Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, it just makes the connection so real, I think. And then when we took a trip to Pittsburgh with some of the students and a couple of the parents who lost children in our shooting, we just felt very close. And unfortunately, it's not a good way to meet, like you said, Rabbi, but we love you so much, and we want to always be connected to you, because we feel that we can lean on each other, and we can also hold each other up, and that's really, really important. It just makes someone feel so good when they know that you understand. So thank you very much for being there for the Parkland community.
So I first met Ivy, as she said, when they came to the Tree of Life. At some date. I don't recall the date, but the date per se really doesn't matter. And that's when Avi and I first met, and we've been connected ever since that date. And this is a natural outgrowth of that connection, are these types of conversations. So I value the friendship we've developed, forged in fire, but stronger than fire. And continue to grow our relationship throughout the course of the years by doing things like this together. And Lauren, as you said, I've always been engaged in Holocaust education for as long as I can recall. So in my earliest times, when I first came to Pittsburgh in August of 2017, I was engaged with the center in programming, well, for a year before the shooting at the Tree of Life. But what's particularly powerful to me is how after we naturally came together. It didn't force us. We naturally did, because we recognized the synergy between what happened in the Tree of Life and the mission of the Holocaust Center. And I think as an outgrowth of that, we continue to work together, particularly as we're in the process of creating, as an as yet unnamed center that'll be housed at the Tree of Life, to be able to find ways to combat hate speech, to partner with other willing partners to do what we can to improve the world, to get to know our neighbors better, to find those specific niches that we can work on together. So again, I revel in the opportunity that there's this post-traumatic growth for both Lauren and I in this regard, to reach out into these new unexplored areas and to see how can we make that go. Lauren's the one who said that we have an obligation
Yes.
to be able to tell the story and to find competent ways to do that using what we know of the Holocaust to continue to grow beyond that and really grow beyond our walls of the Tree of Life into the global village to tell our story and to do what we can to just improve the lot of the world.
And it meant so much when Lauren came to my class. It wasn't even my class, it was a portable classroom because our building is still a crime scene. But I just want to share something about the Pittsburgh community and ours. So I put the list of the shooting victims from Pittsburgh on my board, and I told the students, I didn't want to tell them who, I didn't want to, I gave a little background of each of the victims from Pittsburgh, and I didn't want to say who you need to write to, but let's write to the families of each of these, and you decide who and who, and I'll put them in an envelope and I will send them. So I was proofreading some of them, and it just really touched my heart because the two brothers that were killed at your shul meant so much to one young man who was in my class. He was a senior, his brother was a freshman and killed at ours, and he didn't really talk about it, but in his letter he wrote, I understand what you're feeling. My brother too was killed. And that just made me feel, and it was just so moving, the connection. And it's like you said, not a good connection to have, but at least he felt like he can empathize and really feel what the sister of the two brothers at your shul felt. Because I had met her and she was with us, I believe, in New York at that conference when we went to Now Is Never, Never Is Now. And so I just think that they really felt a connection. They didn't have to know you to feel that close connection to the Pittsburgh community.
Mm-hmm.
That really is something that's hard to articulate, but that connection, that understanding is real. It's there's not even really a word for it, I don't think, but it's real. And so that's what I'm struggling to express, and how meaningful it's been to me to have relationships with the two of you. And I'm grateful, Rabbi, to be doing this work with you, and that you saw that, like, it's a fit for me to come in and work with you on this. That we feel we share the feeling that this makes sense, and that this is an obligation that we can work together to meet.
Which fits into the saying, which I'm full of sayings because I have Holocaust survivor sayings in my head all the time. And my favorite one is that pain should not be wasted. And that is what you both are doing in Pittsburgh.
That is so lovely. Yes, I carry all of these moments with me. And Rabbi, when you're talking about what we're going to come together and we're turning this site of tragedy into a site of hope and remembrance and education, what I'm thinking is we've been able to do so much in this strange time of isolation because of COVID, that we're larger than walls can contain. And so when we come together and the building is opened again, we bring all of that with us into this space. We bring all of this emotion and all of these friendships and this positive energy and an awareness of how much good we can do in the world into a physical space. And I can't wait for that to be a reality.
Yeah.
I'm coming to the grand opening.
The date.
You got it.
Okay. So thank you both. Anything we didn't get to that you might want to say? I think we wrapped it up pretty nicely.
We covered a lot.
Thank you both. I'm so grateful to have both of you in my life to be able to do this work together.
It's endless, and I hope that it will be generations to come, but it is endless, but the most rewarding work ever. So thank you for letting me be a part of your world.
Oh,